Hello students, welcome to the lecture on redemption of preference shares and debentures. And after the lecture we will be able to learn the following objectives. Explain the meaning and the definition of redeemable preference shares, discuss on power to issue redeemable preferences shares, understand the methods of redemption of fully paid up shares, explain the redemption of preference shares by fresh issue of shares, understand redemption of preference shares by capitalization of undistributed profits. Let us start with an introduction to redemption of preference shares and debentures. The company's stocks with dividends are paid to shareholders before common stock dividends are paid out. In the event of a company bankruptcy, preferred stock shareholders have a right to be paid company assets first. Preference shares typically pay a fixed dividend, whereas common stocks do not. And unlike common shareholders, preference shareholders usually do not have voting rights. Convertible preference share is a share that gives its investors the option to convert his preference shares into ordinary equity shares. However, this option can be availed only after a prescribed period. The shareholder gets his dividend at a fixed rate and invests in them as fixed income securities. Convertible preference shares are a good source of fixed income. After a specific period, investors are eligible to convert their preference shares into equity shares. This attracts the investors by giving them an opportunity to profit from the rise in the price of the share. Convertible preference shares are suitable for those investors who have the interest in participating in the growth of the company. It works as a tool of hedging against the fall in the price of the preference share. The fund provided by the owners to a business is known as capital. We know that capital of the business depends upon the form of business organization. From ownership point of view, there are a number of business organizations like sole proprietorship business, partnership business, cooperative societies, joint stock companies, etc. Total capital of the company is divided into a number of small units of fixed amount, and each such unit is called a share. The fixed value of a share register with the registrar of companies is called face nominal value. However, a company can issue shares at a price different from its nominal value or face value. As the total capital of the company is divided into shares, the capital of the company is known as share capital. A company can issue two types of shares, equity shares and preference shares. The issue of preference shares is one of the important sources of capital of a company. Redemption is the process of repaying an obligation at predetermined amounts and timings. The redeemable preference shares are issued on the terms that shareholders will at a future date be repaid amount which they invested in the company. A company can issue only redeemable shares, that is, at present a company cannot issue irredeemable preference shares. Let's now study the meaning and the definition of redeemable preference shares. Preferred shares offer investors tax-effective dividend income. As well, these dividends must be paid before any dividends can be paid to common shareholders. Apart from that, they do not have the potential upside of common shares, and most do not have the possibility of growing dividends, floating rate issues aside. In addition, they rank behind debt holders on the balance sheet. Increasingly, issuers of preferred have removed most of the holder-friendly features that investors used to enjoy, such as hard retraction features and cumulative dividends. This makes preferred less attractive to most investors. There are three ways to better approach the preferred market: seek out hard retraction, cumulative issues, invest in ETFs, invest in split core. These preference shares, which can be redeemed or repaid after the expiry of a fixed period or after giving the prescribed notice as desired by the company, are known as redeemable preference shares. Terms of redemptions are announced at the time of issues of such shares. Redeemable preference shares can be redeemed on or after a period fixed for redemption under the terms of issue or after giving a proper notice of redemption to preference shareholders. The Companies Act, however, imposes certain restrictions for the redemption of preference shares. Irredeemable preference shares are those shares which cannot be redeemed during the lifetime of the company. When the preference shares are issued with the stipulation that these shares are to be redeemed after a certain period of time, then such preference shares are known as redeemable preference shares. The types of preference shares. Equity shares get dividend at a rate fixed at the annual general meeting (AGM) depending on the profit available for a particular year. The rate of dividend also varies from year to year. The preference shareholders contribute capital to the company. They are assured of a preferential dividend at a fixed rate during the life of the company. These type shareholders carry preferential right over other shareholders to be paid first in case of liquidation of the company. Companies use this mode of financing as it is cheaper than raising debt. The preference shares can be of various types. These are as follows: redeemable preference shares. A company may issue these types of shares on the condition that the company will repay the amount of share capitals to the holders of this category of shares after the fixed period or even earlier at the discretion of the company. irredeemable preference shares. The preference shares which do not carry the agreement of redemption are known as irredeemable preference shares. Convertible preference shares. This type of shares enjoys the right to the holder to get them converted into equity shares according to the terms and the conditions of the issue. Non-convertible preference shares. The holders of these shares do not enjoy the right to get the shares converted into equity shares. Unless otherwise stated, preference shares are non-convertible. Participating preference shares. The holder of this type of preference shares enjoy the right to participate in the surplus profits, if any, after the equity shareholders have been paid dividend at a rate fixed in the AGM. So the shareholders get additional dividend with their normal dividend. Non-participating preference shares. These shares carry only a fixed rate of dividend without any right to get additional dividend. Unless otherwise stated, the preference shares are non-participating. Cumulative preference shares. The cumulative preference shares carry the right to a fixed amount of dividend. The holders of these shares are entitled to get dividend out of future profit if current year's profit is insufficient for the same. So the dividend on these shares accumulates till the final payment. Conditions for redemption of preference shares. Before going to redeem the preference share, a company should have to follow the conditions. There must be association regarding the redemption of preference shares. The redeemable preference shares must be fully paid up. If there is any partly paid share, it should be converted into fully paid shares before redemption. The redeemable preference shareholders should be paid out of undistributed profit, distributable profit, or out of fresh issue of shares for the purpose of redemption. Power to issue redeemable preferable shares. Power to issue redeemable preference shares are given as follows. A company limited by shares may, if so authorized by its issue preference shares which are, or at the option of the company are to be liable, to be redeemed, provided that no such shares shall be redeemed except out of profits of the company which would otherwise be available for dividend, or out of the proceeds of a fresh issue of shares made for the purpose of the redemptions. No such shares shall be redeemed unless they are fully paid. The premium, if any, payable on redemption shall have been provided for out of the profits of the company or out of the company's. Purpose of issuing redeemable preference shares. A company may issue redeemable preference shares because of the following reasons. It is a proper way of raising finance in a dull primary market. A company may face difficulty in raising share capital as its shares are not traded on the stock exchange. Potential investors hesitant in putting money into shares that cannot easily be sold may be encouraged to invest if the shares are redeemable by the company. Did you know that around 1250 in France at Toul House, 96 shares of the Société des Moulins de Bozocle or the Bozocle Milling Company were traded at a value that depended on the profitability of the mills the society owned?
When looking at preferred shares, and when they're initially issued by the corporation, they are done so at a par value of $25 per share. In addition to this, the preferred shares will pay a set dividend amount each year, and typically the dividend is paid in quarterly installments. Typically, preferred shares do not have a maturity date. Also, within the investment industry, preferred shares that do not have any kind of retraction feature or conversion feature are often referred to as perpetual or straight preferred shares. Some of the features that preferred shares carry that would benefit the company and not the individual investor that buys them are the set dividend amount for perpetuity. These are often called perpetual or straight preferred shares. The set annual dividend amount does not change from the date of issuance right for the life of the shares. Straight preferred shares provide the company with a high degree of certainty as to what their costs and expenses will be in relation to the issue. The second feature that benefits companies is the redeemable feature. This feature grants the company the option to buy back your preferred shares at a set price or prices at set dates at some time in the future. If the company decides to redeem a preferred share, unfortunately, as a shareholder, you have no choice. You must sell your shares back to the company at the stipulated price on the stipulated date. In addition to these features, a company may also have the ability to delay or skip dividend payments without actually triggering what's called a credit event, such as a default. If they do such, then as an investor, you're going to want to know what feature is in place on the preferred share. Are the dividends cumulative or are they non-cumulative? Cumulative feature dictates that if the company delays or skips a preferred share dividend payment, then the unpaid dividends are simply accumulated, and eventually they must be paid to the preferred shareholder if the preferred shares are ever redeemed, or if the company ever wants to pay common share dividends, they must repay all of the accumulated dividends to the preferred shareholder prior to paying common share dividends. If the preferred shares have a feature that's non-cumulative, it means the company can skip or delay the preferred share dividend payment, and those unpaid dividends do not accumulate for future payment. They simply disappear. If the dividends are cumulative and the company decides to redeem the preferred shares, the company then must pay all declared but unpaid dividends upon the redemption. It's important to note, in the event that dividends are delayed or skipped on a preferred share, shareholders are generally granted limited voting rights as a class, and they have the ability to elect one or more directors on the company's board.
The methods of redemption of fully paid up shares. Redemption of preference shares means repayment by the company of the obligation on account of shares issued. According to the Companies Act, preference shares issued by a company must be redeemed within the maximum period allowed under the Act. Thus, a company cannot issue irredeemable preference shares. It ensures that there is no reduction in shareholders' funds due to redemption, and thus the interest of outsiders is not impaired. For this, it requires that either fresh issue of shares is made or distributable profits are retained and transferred to capital redemption reserve account. The rationale behind these provisions is to protect the interest of outsiders to whom the amount is payable before redemption of preference share capital. The interest of outsiders is protected if the nominal value of capital redeemed is substituted, thus ensuring the same amount of shareholders' fund. In case of redemption of preference shares out of proceeds of a fresh issue of shares, replacement of capital and tangible assets is obvious. But if redemption is done out of distributable profits, replacement of capital is ensured in an indirect manner by retention of profit by transfer to capital redemption reserve. The amount which would have gone to shareholders in the form of dividend is retained in the business and is used for settling the claim of preference shareholders. Thus, there is no additional claim on net assets of the company. The transfer of divisible profits to capital redemption reserve makes them non-distributable profits. As capital redemption reserve can be used only for issues of fully paid bonus shares, profits retained in the business ultimately get converted into share capital.
For a lot of people, they don't really know what a preferred share is. They've heard of it, but they really don't understand how it works. So that's what we're going to cover in this unit. And in this lesson specifically, we're just going to go through the fundamentals of a preferred share. So when you look at this chart, you can see that the lowest risk that you're going to have on any investment is a bond when you're dealing with stocks or bonds. The preferred share is actually right in the middle on the risk, and then the common share, which we've talked about up to this point in the previous units and lessons, has all been common shares. So a preferred share is actually kind of in the middle as far as actually owning some of the equity of the business, but the preferred share performs like a bond. So as we go in the next slide, you're going to kind of see how that works. But as far as the thing that you got to really understand as far as risk is that the preferred share isn't as risky as owning common shares, but it is definitely more risky than just owning the bond of a company. One of the unique things about a preferred share is a lot of people would think that it would operate and have a lot of the same fundamentals as a common share, but it actually operates a lot more like a bond. So whenever you buy a preferred share, it's instead of having a coupon, it's going to have a dividend. A preferred share is a proportional piece of equity in a business. Now, what will confuse a lot of people is your piece of that business, your equity of that business, is only going to come about if the company would liquidate. So that proportional ownership that you own of that business really isn't doing anything for you as far as like the market price of that preferred share changing. Unless that company would liquidate, that's whenever whatever's left, if not all the money would go to the bondholders, whatever money would be left would then be paid to the preferred shareholders. And then any money that would be left over after both the bondholder and the preferred shareholder would be paid would then go to the common shareholders. And so that situation, in my personal opinion, is very unlikely. If you go through a liquidation of bankruptcy for a business, pretty much the bondholders are the only ones that are going to be able to get anything that remains in the business. So that share of equity that you're actually getting with the preferred share, in my opinion, really isn't worth anything because 9 times out of 10, if a company would go bankrupt and liquidate, all that money's going to be going to the bondholders, and the preferred shareholders and the common shareholders are pretty much going to lose everything at that point. So how does a preferred share work? As you can see here on the left-hand side, I have a bond, okay, and we're just going to call this Company X. So one bond of Company X. We're going to say that the term on the bond is 30 years. And if this terminology isn't making sense for you, I strongly encourage you to go back to Course 1, Unit 2 in order to take the 3 lessons about bonds. And all of this will be crystal clear after you take those lessons. So go back and take a look at those if these terms aren't making sense for you. But let's say on the left-hand side we have a bond. The term is 30 years. The face value is $1,000, and the coupon is $50. So our yield, we know based off of those figures, would give us a 5% yield on that bond. So just like that, we have one preferred share of Company X, okay? And let's just say that the term on that preferred share is 30 years. The face value, instead of it being $1,000, is only $25, and it pays an annual dividend of $1.50 a year. And so when you would take that dividend and divide it by the face value, you'd get actually a 6% yield. So this preferred share is very much like the bond in that it has a term, it has a face value. Instead of a coupon, it's now a dividend. The nice thing about the preferred share is it's a cheaper price than the $1,000 for the face value on the bond. But it's operating exactly through the same fundamentals. Now, a lot of preferred shares don't have a term. Now, a lot of preferred shares don't have a term of 30 years or 10 years. They're perpetual in term. So this scenario is kind of a unique one. You're not going to see that real common. It's much more common to see a perpetual preferred share, meaning that they'll issue it and it's out there until they decide to terminate the preferred share by buying it back. So, but you can find preferred shares with term limits on them.
The redemption of preference shares by fresh issues of shares. One of the methods for redemption of preference shares is to use the proceeds of a fresh issue of shares. A company can issue new shares, equity share or preference share, and the proceeds from such new shares can be used for redemption of preference shares. The proceeds from issues of debentures cannot be utilized for the purpose. A problem arises when a fresh issue is made for the purpose of redemption of preference shares at a premium. The point to ponder is that whether the proceeds of a fresh issue of shares will include the amount of securities premium for the purpose of redemption of preference shares. For Security Premium Account, Companies Act provides that in paying up unissued shares of the company to be issued to members of the company as fully paid bonus shares, in writing of the preliminary expenses of the company, in writing of the expenses of or the commission paid or discount allowed on any issue of shares or debentures of the company, in providing for the premium payable on the redemption of any redeemable preference shares or of any debentures of the company. Any other way in which securities premium account is utilized will be in contravention of law. It is interesting to know that the premium on redemption of preference shares to be adjusted against securities premium account, but the redemption itself, it cannot be financed out of the securities premium account. Again, a problem may arise when the fresh issue is made at a discount. Proceeds in connection with issue of shares at a discount would mean only the net amount received, that is the face value less the discount. Therefore, when the shares are issued at a discount, then the number of shares to be issued at a discount should be manipulated to ensure that at least the face value of the shares to be redeemed has been procured in money out of the proceeds of the fresh issue at a discount. Reasons for issue of new equity shares. A company may prefer issue of new equity shares for the following reasons. When the company has come to realize that the capital is needed permanently and it makes more sense to issue equity shares in place of redeemable preference shares, which carry a fixed rate of dividend. When the balance of profit, which would otherwise be available for dividend, is insufficient. When the liquidity position of the company is not good enough. The advantages of redemption of preference shares by issue of fresh equity shares. Following are the advantages of redemption of preference shares by the issue of fresh equity shares. No cash outflow of money now or later. New equity shares may be valued at a premium. No capital gains tax for shareholders. Shareholders retain their equity interests. Disadvantages of redemption of preference shares by issue of fresh equity shares. The disadvantages are, there's a possibility of dilution of further earnings. Shareholders in the company are changed. Redemption of preferable shares by capitalization of undistributed profits. Another method for redemption of preference shares as per the Companies Act is to use the distributable profits in place of issuing new shares. When shares are redeemed by utilizing distributable profit, an amount equal to the face value of shares redeemed is transferred to capital redemption reserve account by debiting the distributable profit. In other words, some of the distributable profits are kept aside to ensure that it can never be distributed to shareholders as dividend. In this connection, the provisions of the Companies Act state that when any such shares are redeemed otherwise, then out of the proceeds of a fresh issue, there shall, out of profits which would otherwise have been available for dividend, be transferred to a reserve fund to be called the Capital Redemption Reserve Account, sum equal to the nominal amount of the shares redeemed. Advantages. The advantages of redemption of preference shares by capitalization of undistributed profits are: no change in the percentage shareholdings of the company, future earnings are not diluted, surplus funds can be used. The disadvantages of redemption of preference shares by capitalization of undistributed profits are: there may be a reduction in liquidity, capital gains tax liability for preference shareholders, redemption of preference shares by combination of fresh issue and capitalizations of undistributed profits. A company can redeem the preference shares partly from the proceeds from new issue and partly out of profits. In order to fill in the gap between the face value of shares redeemed and the proceeds of new issue, a transfer to be made from distributable profits. The sales of investments to provide sufficient funds for redemption. Companies may have sufficient investments which can be sold in the market to arrange funds for redemption of preference shares. Redemptions of partly called up preference shares. One of the conditions of redemption is that only fully paid up preference shares can be redeemed by a company. If the examination problem states that it is decided to redeem preference shares which are partly called up, then it is assumed that final call on these shares is demanded and received before proceeding with redemption of these shares. If information about both fully paid and partly paid preference shares is provided, then only fully paid shares are redeemed. In case of forfeited shares, if, on getting a proper notice from the company, the shareholders fail to pay the unpaid calls, the board of directors may decide to forfeit the shares and cancel these shares instead of reissuing the forfeited shares, because redemption of these shares is due immediately or in the near future. In this case, entry for forfeiture is passed as usual. It is worth noting that to ensure replacement of capital out of proceeds of a fresh issue or out of divisible profits, total preference share capital, including the shares forfeited and cancelled, should be considered. Now, in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. The redeemable preference shares are issued on the terms that shareholders will at a future date be repaid amount which they invested in the company. Those preference shares which can be redeemed or repaid after the expiry of a fixed period or after giving the prescribed notice as desired by the company are known as redeemable preference shares. Redemption of preference shares means repayment by the company of the obligation on account of shares issued. Corporate houses that have issued redeemable preference shares will have to continue treating them as equity capital. One of the methods for redemption of preference shares is to use the proceeds of a fresh issue of shares.